토마르 뜨거운 선도는 가르쳐 모려와 대연의 생제상지 송지자 공문 토벌사 지도 당하는 다음에 주인년 바에서
Initially, our motivation is always the most important thing. So let us again at this moment here check our motivation and make sure that we strive by way of listening to this Dharma instructions to bring about the greatest possible benefit for the welfare of all beings. Already this morning we have heard a little bit of the origin of this particular tradition, in particular how there are two lineages or two transmission lineages for this teaching of the 7 points of mind training. Predominantly there's two lineages known as the far-reaching conduct and the lineage of the profound view. This text and then continues to, in the commentary, it then continues to describe the lineage as being the heart essence of the teachings of all the victorious ones and their sons, meaning all the Buddhas and their Bodhisattvas, which have been handed down through all the masters in an unbroken and completely pure lineage down to the great Bodhisattva who is known under the name of Serlingpa. And this Serlingpa was among the many various teachers that Atisha had, one of his main teachers. So from him Atisha received this transmission. Yet another master from whom Atisha received this transmission of this teaching of these bodhisattva commitments, etc., was the great master Dharma Rakshita. It says in the text here that he was possessed of such extraordinary compassion that he was able to even offer the flesh of his own body to other beings. And where this particular transmission is concerned, there was yet a third teacher from whom Atisha received all of these instructions. He had the ability, as it is said here in the commentary, to take upon himself the suffering of all beings. His name correspondingly is the yogin who is endowed with extraordinary loving kindness. In Tibetan that would be Jamgön. And in the presence of these three teachers, Atisha trained himself for considerable time until a very definite experience was born within himself. When Atisha then finally went to Tibet himself, he had already become such an extraordinary teacher in his own right that he was able to spread all of these transmissions and teachings in the country of Tibet to purify all impurities, etc. And among the various transmissions that he brought into Tibet, he is famous for having brought particularly this one, as well as various lineages of White Tara transmission, etc.
And George about the Atisha, Namta Dupa, Huna, and Kongtrul de Jagar Shaso, Sahorge Yola, Bangala, he Petrunchekin, the Trunchetin on Chondu.
Looking very briefly at the biography of Atisha himself, he was born in a country or in a region of India known as Sahor, and he was born in the city of Bangala.
And the Yap Jarbug, Sena, Yap Jarbu, Giva Pai, Yum Panmu Weze, and the Yan Yela, say some Chondu, then say Ringate, then Atisha.
Atisha was born into a highly aristocratic royal caste. His father was a local king known as the Splendor of Virtue, or Givapal in Tibetan, whereas his mother was known as Radiating Light, or Prabha. And these parents of his had 3 sons. Atisha was the middle one of them.
And then Konga Mena, David Nimbo,
David
And these royal parents of Atisha's, they initially named him heart or essence of the moon, which is approximately Chandra Garbha in Sanskrit.
and then Guno Toga Gazu, Sanu, Rekbeni, Tamji, and Kepa Chemuri.
And it is said that at the age of 6, he was already very learned in all the sciences.
And then Guno Chochi Gala, then Kongtrul and Shaba Jachambo Tangumi. And then Sentin Urbotan, then Jimba Jachambo Tongling. And then Konga Yayon, Chepa, don't go to Jachamon Zeba, and Dios.
At the tender age of 11 already, he was famous for making great offerings and giving offerings, particularly to the poor in the country, and also to his kind parents. He made particularly wonderful and great offerings.
And then Guno Josonga, because Kongi Lembo Dang, Jekonso, Me, Josum, Dala, and then Trasepla, Tradon, Shinong, Sebla, Pedu, and then Dromzi, Zeta, Namjun Pahin Yal.
At the age of 13, the young Atisha, or the one who was to become Atisha, went on an outing with several retainers and ministers, 13 people in all. They were riding in the woods and up into the hill country, where at a certain place they came upon a Brahmin named Jitari. He was living in this forest, in this hilly region as a hermit, and the young Atisha paid homage to him, and after having venerated him and made offerings to him, this Brahmin then proceeded to teach him the very essence of the teaching of the 3 jewels.
And then Kongi, they call Nalendra, Chudi Chambo. Tinona, Kongi Sondu, then Tanala, and Pentrata, Lama Songchu, Zombo, Tigan, and then Songchu Santa Dambazi.
And then eventually, as Atisha got a little bit older, he went to the great and then famous monastic university of Nalanda, where from the great scholar, the Mahapandita Bodhibhadra, he received the initial commitments of the Bodhisattvahood.
And then Nalendra Pentrata, Ripo Onsu, Tigan, then Yon Songchu Santa Dambat.
And from yet another master there in Nalanda called Rigpa Wangchuk in Tibetan, he received clear explanations and elucidations on all the salient features of the Bodhisattva commitment, etc. Then later on, from a yogin and accomplished master named Rahula, he received the Hevajra empowerments and instructions. After which he then proceeded to practice Hevajra, both the development as well as the perfection process meditations, and in this way familiarizing himself thoroughly with this particular practice.
to Serlingpa, Pentata, Serlingpa, and Jamgön, those a long thing.
And it was this master, Rahula, from whom Atisha received all of these instructions, who prophesied to him, who said to him, your main teacher is the great master, Serlingpa, so you should eventually go to meet this master.
Serlingpa, and it was in on the Trozin on a Trozin on a pebble. They Trozin on a pebble, and a capture the party, that was in it, and it jumped to me down to unit and ballot, non colors around the party, having do, and in Konriga, Jiba Jumala, Sansa, Tahi Pambamana, Nasum Gimana, Tori Longrima, Toddy Jitum, Tadung to chapters, Romana, so Atane, then in Dungeon Nongala, Jazzy Roman, Shar Zeni, then in Dingipa Tongi, and in Japson.
As Atisha then set out on his way to meet Serlingpa, there was a long and dangerous journey to be made. Serlingpa, incidentally, who lived on the island of Bali in Indonesia, could only be reached by way of the seas. So he went onto a boat, went into that long journey, and on such a journey, of course, there are great dangers, particularly out there on the ocean. There were many storms. And once, when they were caught up in such a great storm, Atisha prayed fervently to Tara with the famous words of his, to her who alleviates the 8 and 16 fears, I prostrate. To her who shows everything to be empty, I prostrate. To her who closes the door to the lower realms, I prostrate. To her who leads the way to the higher realms, I prostrate, etc. At this particular occasion, he uttered this famous prayer to Tara.
And it was Serlingpa, Jani, and a Konga, Songju Sanga, Dhamma, Chepaji, Tangi, Nam, and a Yayum, and a Songma, Chulana Mapa, Tenda, Dhamma, Mundrawa, Mombo Hune, and a Lord Unikitsella, Serlingpa, Danayo.
And after having then eventually met his master Serlingpa, he received all the instructions and teachings that he requested from him, as well as many other profound instructions of the secret Mantrayana or Vajrayana, as it is also commonly known. All in all, it is said that Atisha spent 12 years at the feet of his master Serlingpa.
And George Jagala to Pep, and Jagal to Pet, and then Bella, Tambotan, cannot choose them down, that can take a gala, song to get them, Master Yapo, and young Tapa song to get them, but Dar. And then it says Jabo long Dharma, then song to them, but there's no song. And it day into Denny, Benata, Pegger, then Chu Tongi, number Chu Tongi, Gashi, Tapo, Gashi, Madaba, then our move.
So eventually, after all of these years, Atisha then returned to India. And shortly after his return to India, he was then approached by Tibetan students to please come to Tibet to help spread the Dharma there. Now, to which he eventually consented. Now, at this time, we have to imagine the situation in Tibet itself. Roughly 250, 300 years before Atisha's coming, the Dharma had been established and spread in Tibet in a great and very successful way by Guru Rinpoche, Khenpo Bodhisattva, and the Dharma king Trisong Detsen. But shortly before Atisha's time, there was an evil king in Tibet named Lang Dharma who did his very best to suppress and where he could destroy the Dharma. And eventually, at this particular time, there were certain, one can say, underground lineages of practitioners who kept practicing the Dharma, some of them in quite an okay way, others in a very confused and a very impure way. And there was great confusion in Tibet at the time about what is true Dharma and what is not.
Lama Song Chu, that Tige and not so Rotawa, Java Tendu Singer to Rotawa, Tang, then in Jagala, some other Yacheron Pelaki, Pebruki, then Song Chi, Tambashan, the Nation, not room to the Huay.
At this time, then, at Atisha's time, there was a king in western Tibet known under the name of La Lama Jamgön, who was very much interested in reviving the Dharma. And consequently, he sent 2 translators from Tibet to India, Nakso Lodsawa and Lodsawa Tsendri Sengye, to find a master which they could invite to Tibet in order to revive the Dharma. And it was these 2 Tibetan translators who then approached Atisha and requested his coming to Tibet. These 2 translators then insisted for a long time, asking Atisha to please come to Tibet, arguing predominantly that the Dharma, the Buddha Dharma, was on the verge of extinction and that he would be the only one who could possibly revive the Dharma there. So Atisha prayed fervently to his deity, to Tara, and indeed she revealed herself to him in a vision, and she said, well, if you work to go to Tibet, you would indeed bring about great benefit, and you will also meet your main disciple, your main student, the teacher of Drom, known commonly as Drom Tenpa. After this vision, Atisha then decided indeed that would be what he would have to do, and he packed his belongings together, he got himself a staff, and off he went to Tibet. So when these 2 translators, Nakso Lodsawa and Tsendri Sengye, came to Nalanda, the entire Sangha of the monastery knew right away that these Tibetans were up to no good. They were going to get one of their most accomplished and learned teachers to invite him to come to Tibet, and they all decided, whenever they were being asked by these 2 Tibetans who Atisha might be and where he might be, that they just would not tell. So consequently, whenever they were being approached, any one of them was approached by these 2 Tibetan translators, and they asked, who is Atisha, where do we find Atisha? They all said, like, Atisha, who's that? Never heard of such a person. There is no such person here. And it took a while until, by accident, they found out the identity of Atisha, which happened when Atisha himself was out on the streets giving some sweets to some children who all gathered around him, shouting his name, wanting some more. Then eventually the secret was lifted, and they were able then to meet Atisha and invite him to come to Tibet. So Atisha then eventually went to Tibet. He found the situation in Tibet as has been described previously, and he was able to revive the Buddha Dharma where it had completely disappeared. He was able to eradicate misunderstandings and mistakes where these had crept into people's view and understanding and practice. And in this way he was extremely beneficial for the Tibetan people, for the Tibetan practitioners and students of the Buddha Dharma. It was also at that time that Atisha composed his main work, the torch, known as the torch on the path that leads to awakening. And it is a text of his and this main work of his. He says that there are 3 types of individual endowed with 3 types of capacity, and that according to these 3 types of capacities, the Buddha Dharma ought to be taught. The first region in which Atisha stayed in Tibet, Western Tibet, incidentally known as Ngari, he stayed there for 3 years, teaching and propagating the Dharma widely. Then he proceeded to another region known as Nyetang, where he stayed for 9 years, and then he proceeded to what is known as Ütsang in Tibet, the central Tibetan provinces, where he stayed another 5 years. And in the course of that time, he also met his destined main disciple, Jamgön. He was very active in this time, teaching and practicing and spreading the Dharma, and altogether it was then 17 years that he spent teaching continuously. Among all the many students that Atisha had in Tibet, there were 3 of them. The first one was Rubish is going to repeat the names now for all of us. Okay, the first one was Kurten Tsundru Yungdrung. Then there was Ngok Lek Bishap, and then there was Jamgön, who was dropped in. Among these 3, there was Jamgön, better known as Jamgön, who was considered to be an emanation of the great compassionate one, Avalokiteshvara or Chenrezig. Jamgön himself also continued to teach the Dharma among his students. There were again 3 main students known as Putowa, Chengawa, and Pachungwa. The main practice of the first of these 3 students, known as Putowa, apart from consistently contemplating the enlightened attitude, Bodhicitta, was to constantly, in whatever situation, contemplate the impermanent nature. Now, the student of Jamgön, Putowa, being famous for having consistently in all situations contemplated the impermanent nature of everything, he is very famous for having practiced very intensively, and there's a famous story about him which deals particularly with the place in which he was practicing in retreat. He stayed in seclusion in the wilderness, inhabited a small rocky cave, in front of which there was a thorny bush. Every now and then, of course, he had to leave his cave to relieve himself. And each and every time when he did so, his clothes got caught in that bush. And each and every time as that happened, he thought, well, shouldn't I cut that bush down just to have it out of the way and not to be caught in it all the time? But each and every time when he was just about to do so, he reminded himself of the fact of impermanence. And he thought, well, who knows, I might not have to leave my cave again, because impermanence might strike, death might come, and then I had better spend my time practicing and considering impermanence, considering the empty nature of appearances and phenomena, etc. And he just went back to meditate. Whenever he again had to leave, the same story repeated itself, but yet again he always reminded himself of the impermanent nature of phenomena and appearances, and eventually that bush actually never got cut down, and he spent every conceivable moment, every possible moment considering impermanence and the empty nature itself. So then eventually Jamgön transmitted various aspects of this teaching to his three disciples, Putowa, Chengawa, and Puchungwa. And to one he gave the transmission, or to one he gave the order to continue the textual transmission. For the next one he gave the order to continue the tradition of the explanation of the general meaning. And to the third one he gave the order to continue the tradition of the explicit instructions. In this way, these lineages of the three types have been introduced into and continued within Tibet. And all of these teachings were then eventually summarized and became known as the 6 main texts, or the 6 main treatises of the Kadampa tradition. The first 2 of these 6 Kadampa root texts, the first of them deals with the previous lifetimes of the Buddha himself. The second one is a general collection of teachings and advice which explain about the law of cause and effect, which explain about the deeds of the Bodhisattvas, which are all designed in order to bring about confidence and devotion in the student who studies and who puts into practice these teachings. The third of these 6 texts is known as Bodhisattva Bhumi, the fourth is known as the Sutra Alamkara. Both of these texts are designed to bring about stability in the meditative concentration of the student. And then there are texts number 5 and number 6. Number 5 is the famous Bodhicharya Vatara, the introduction to the conduct of bodhisattvas, and the 6th text is known as the summary of all pith instructions. Both of these texts, both of which proposed by Shantideva, bring about the increase of cognitive awareness, of intellectual reasoning, of insight which is being brought about through wisdom.
다디 가동 용주들라 나는 자도 때는 되게 해봐 까봐봐데 근데 예루발을 까봐봐 이거예요.
The further propagation of these 6 main texts and all the treatises and all the practices, etc., which are connected with these, nowadays lies within the hands of the Gelugpa tradition.
아니 덴바예가 담마 덴베 감사 단지 요래 덴바예 다디게 감스게 메마데 가지파라 까봐봐래.
However, the particular instructions which deal with the 4 types of validity or the 4 types of truth, as they were taught by the Buddha and everything that goes along with these instructions, this has come into the province of the Kagyipa traditions.
가동 틀리 주루 주루 되는 배다 단지게 되는 왕 예바지 효조래 되는 가동 틀리 주루 왕효 디게 되는 감사 탐지게 강네 단지 냥린자바데 되는 예루바라 요래 가지파라 인가라데 요래.
And then there's the tradition of the so-called 16 bindus, or the 16 essential instructions, which contain various large empowerment cycles, etc. These are being continued both within the Kagyu and Gelugpa traditions.
되는 가동파라 되는 라주동만 렌렌즈 가동파가 여동가 라예 땡도 되는 성지 샤자토게 르반제고 이 지진제 강수 성지게 땡바 담보 배워를 잡아 되는 생진 탕지라 롱도가 롱 땡바 보이비나 다 대라 되는 도와가 되는 영린제 인제고.
Particularly within the Kadampa traditions, there is great focus when it comes to actual practice, actual training itself, upon what is known as the 4 deities of the Kadampa tradition. And the first and foremost of these is none other but the Buddha Shakyamuni himself, having been the originator of all Dharma in the first place. The main emphasis of practice, of all practices within the Kadampa tradition, being the development of loving kindness, compassion, and Bodhicitta, then that being the case, the second most important deity within the practice of all Kadampa traditions is the one who is the embodiment of all the compassion and loving kindness of all Buddhas, known as Avalokiteshvara or Chenrezig. In order to bring about protection and alleviation of the so-called 8 or 16 fears, the outer hindrances that could plague our practice, they then practice predominantly the meditations of Noble Tara. And then within the Kadampa traditions, there's the 4th practice of these 4 deities, which is predominantly designed to pacify hindrances and obstacles of the body, all of these obstacles which come along with the subtle channels, energies, and essences. And that is the deity Achala, also known as Myowa in Tibet. Now when it comes to the Kadampa tradition, there are altogether 7 teachings or dharmas, so to speak, which characterize that particular practice. There are these 4 deities, as has been described, making up one of these 7. Then there are the, when it comes to the actual speech of the Buddha, the actual teaching of the Buddha, there we have the 3 vast and great collections of the Buddha's teachings. And then when it comes to the actual implementation by way of practicing with the mind, there are the so-called 3 trainings.
Haba Sorumja, Haba Tam, Haba Sherab, Haba Tingen, Haba Ti, Tobi, and then Sanjin.
When it comes to the third category, which pertain to the enlightened awareness of the Buddha, there are these three trainings. The first of these is the training of disciplined conduct. The second is the training of meditative concentration, and the third and final of these is the training within cognitive awareness or wisdom. In this way, within the Kadampa tradition, both the schools or traditions of the Sutra approach as well as that of the Mantrayana or Vajrayana approach are being combined by way of teaching the combination of the empty nature of phenomena and appearances as well as that of loving kindness and compassion. When it comes to the actual practice of these, the predominant practice is that of giving rise to the enlightened attitude, also known as Bodhicitta. And the first step, of course, we give rise to the so-called conventional enlightened attitude, which deals with the world of phenomena and appearances as we perceive them. It is that kind of bodhicitta that we give rise to, which allows us to, for once, give up that these preconditioned habitual tendencies of ours to constantly only work for our own benefit, for our own welfare, and to exchange that for the welfare of others. And then eventually, having trained ourselves in this way, we will then proceed to the practice of the ultimate bodhicitta. Once we're still on that first level, we first start out by way of giving rise to the bodhicitta of aspiration, and once that has been brought about, we will then proceed to put into practice the actual bodhicitta of application. As we have initially heard, there are a great number of many various different instructions concerning this bodhicitta, this enlightened attitude, how to give rise to it, how to maintain it, etc. And it was particularly the author of the root text of the 7 points of mind training, Chakava Yeshe Dorje, who has summarized them in this particular form that nowadays is known as the 7 points of mind training. Rinpoche wants to call an end to this session now. We have a little bit of time should there be any questions concerning these